Hi, Rhema. It's week 7, day 5 of our Bible narrative reading plan. Today we finish Exodus chapter 4, and we're also going to be in Psalm chapter 77. As we pick back up in verse 18 of Exodus chapter 4, we see that Moses, he has spoken with God, and God is commissioning him. He's sending him back to Egypt to be a deliverer, and Moses speaks to his father-in-law Jethro and says, "Please send me back in peace to my people." And so Moses and his sons, they saddle up their donkeys. They're headed back to the land of Egypt. And the Lord tells Moses, he says, when you go back to Egypt, you're going to do these miracles and all that I have given you and your power, which is a reminder that it's ultimately God's power in which Moses is acting. And he says, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let my people go. That's an interesting phrase because as we're going to see, Pharaoh hardens his own heart many times, and then ultimately God seals him in that heartedness, and Pharaoh's fate is sealed. And this is something that's referenced again throughout the New Testament. And we see here even this the emphasis on the firstborn, that God is calling Israel his firstborn son. This is language and imagery that's used throughout the book of Exodus and again throughout the Bible. And so God is sending Moses back to Egypt, but he's letting him know what he's going to face when he gets there. And then verses 24 through 26 are a very interesting set of verses. We can't go into great detail just because of the length of this video, but I want to give you just a broad idea of what's going on there. God has remembered the covenant. That's the language, even though we know God didn't forget. God is reminding his people that they are part of the covenant, and God is acting upon the covenant. He's fulfilling his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob to protect and preserve his people. But just as God is doing his part, God's people have to also keep up their part of the covenant. And part of that was the sign of the covenant, which was circumcision. And Moses has failed to circumcise his own son. And it's a reminder that if they didn't keep their part of the covenant, they would be cut off from God. And so Moses' life is in danger because he's failed to keep the sign of the covenant with his son, and yet Moses' life is again miraculously preserved because of the actions of someone else, not of his own self, but the actions of, in this case, his wife. She preserves his life because she circumcises their son. And then the story continues. God leads Moses back to the land of Egypt. The Lord talks to Aaron and tells him to go in the wilderness to meet Moses, and so they do meet up, and Moses tells Aaron what God has done in his life and what God is calling them to do. And it says in verse 31, and the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped. That should be our response as well. When we are reminded of God's mighty acts, God's mighty deeds on our behalf, we ought to worship him because of what he's done for us, because of his great salvation for us. And we see in Psalm 77, this is not written by Moses, but it is written about that time in the life of Moses. It points us back to God's provision for his people. It points us back to the Exodus. And so the psalm concludes, as you read it all the way through, it tells us that God is holy. What kind of God is great like our God? And it points back to God's preservation of his people, of the people of Jacob, of Joseph. It says in verse 15, it points us forward to what we're going to see in a few days with the Exodus, with the parting of the Red Sea, God's mighty work on behalf of his people. Verse 20 summarizes it all. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. As we're going to see God do mighty, miraculous things in the book of Exodus, and we're inspired by the lives of people like Moses and Aaron, we ought to never forget that it's ultimately God who is leading his people. And God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He will continue to lead his people by his word and his spirit. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.